Let's talk about style. There are a number of ways to style components in React. The simplest is just to use CSS, same as you always would. Just put a CSS file in your source directory and then just make sure you import it somewhere. The way that Webpack is configured, that's going to be just fine. That'll work. You notice app.js is already importing a file called app.css. It's not unusual to just make a CSS file per component and put all your styles for that component in that one file. There is nothing magic about that, though. There's nothing that keeps those rules from styling other components. They're all still just global styles. So that's part of why we use the class names that are named after the component. So inside your CSS, you could say .app space and then whatever rule you want so that you're scoping it to that component. But it's not automatically scoped to that component just because that's where you imported it. Wherever you imported it, as long as it's imported, that's going to just be part of your global style. But by convention, for the sake of organizing your stuff, you might want to do that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to put some of our global styles inside app.css. If you look at the static files that we copied to the public folder, we had notes HTML, signin.html, and we had style.css. So here's all the CSS that's in that static version. So if I just take everything up to line 30, where the .app rule ends, just copy all that stuff. Open up app.css, which has some stuff that was in there by default. I'm just going to get rid of all that and paste in those 30 lines of CSS. What am I doing? First, I'm importing a couple of fonts. Then, what does star mean? It's a wildcard. It means any element on the page. And we have box sizing border box. We don't really need this old version. Everybody know what that means? Box sizing border box. If you remember your dev tools, if you look at the Elements tab, you see this thing here that shows you the CSS box model, basically. You've got your element, you've got your padding, you've got your border and your margin. If you set the width of an element, do you know which portions of that are included in the width? The content and the padding? By default, it is the content only, which is not how it feels like it ought to be. That is not how it feels like it ought to be. So for example, if you say width equals 100% and then you add some padding, well, you're wider than the page now. And until recently, it was a pain in the neck to say, okay, 100% except for the 16 pixels of padding that I want. So 100% minus 16 pixels. You can do that using some modern CSS, but that's a pain in the neck too. It makes a whole lot more sense if the padding were just included. So what box sizing border box does is includes the padding and the border. So now it's everything except the margin, which is kind of how it feels like it ought to be. So when you're saying the width now, you're saying the entire element should take up this much space. The margin is just the space between elements. But the element, which includes its padding and its border, should take up however much space I set. So we're just setting that right off the bat so we don't confuse ourselves. I'm setting the font size of the HTML element to 10 pixels, not the body, but the HTML element. Anybody know why? Do you remember what a rim is, that unit that we've used? It's relative to the font size of the whole page, specifically of the HTML element. So we are setting a rim equal to 10 pixels. Nice round number, easy to remember. So now one rim equals 10 pixels. We're setting the font size for the body, and then we're not using rims for some reason. We're setting the line height. We're setting a margin of 0. I'm setting vertical align middle on images. And I'm styling my H1s through H5s to use a particular font and a particular color and a particular weight. That seems like it ought to be quoted. That's not going to work if it's not quoted. And then just style that one component. To have a font family of Oxygen. If it doesn't find that, that's a Google font. We'll use Helvetica, failing that, Arial, failing that, whatever sans serif happens to be available. And again, there's this missing semicolon there. So if I save that and I look, all right, now everything's on the left, so that's a change. I believe that font looks different, so I'm going to assume this all worked. Looks good to me. So again, what we did there, we just put in a regular old CSS file, and we just made sure we imported that somewhere in one of my JavaScript files that's actually being used. And it's not really scoping this CSS to that component. We have to do that with the way we write our CSS. But it helps us keep it organized. So style app. Importing a plain old CSS file.